Joining me now in the studio is Air-Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Welcome to you, Sean. Good to see you. So there it is. The West is taking perhaps now a more cautious approach. Is support really waning?
I think we've got to be very careful. The facts around Poland, there's a lot of history behind that. First of all, Poland has been one of the best supporters of Ukraine throughout this war, not only for military aid, but also it's opened its doors to all of the refugees pouring out, literally millions pouring out the country. The one thing that Poland drew a line on was that it said when Ukraine couldn't export its grain south across the Baltic, it now wants to push its grain north, and that meant loads of grain was going to arrive in Europe and undercut all of the Polish farmers. And they went, no, we won't tolerate that. We're going to put some sort of tariff on. That would probably have gone unnoticed, really, but for the fact President Zelensky has just spent 3 days out of the US, had a really rough time with the UN and the UN Security Council. He looks absolutely haggard. 18 months of war is just riven onto his face, and his undiplomatic language of being critical about Poland. Funny old thing, Poland turns around and says, well, we won't put up with that. If you continue like that, we're going to unwind and stop providing weapons. But the harsh reality of this is, first of all, is that Poland has a vested interest in making sure Ukraine prevails, because if it doesn't, it's Poland next. And likewise, I almost certainly, we've already seen the language soften on the diplomatic front. It looks likely this is going to be tomorrow morning, Zelensky have a good night's sleep, pick up the phone, and probably that issue will have been resolved.
So essentially this was really just an economic issue for a domestic area of Ukraine policy.
It is, but it does strike a chord. And I think the bigger issue here is that at the start of the conflict, Ukraine's ambition was to liberate all of its territory, and the West's ambition was to make sure Russia couldn't present a threat to Europe. So they sort of aligned. Yeah. If you look at it today, Ukraine's objectives haven't really changed. But from a West perspective, Russia militarily will take a decade to recover from the war. It's lost so many tanks, so much equipment. It was trying to stop NATO expanding. NATO has expanded. Yep. It was trying to make Russia great again. Its economy is taking a good kicking, and President Putin is indicted by the criminal court. But the short story is that actually the West doesn't appear to look at Russia as a threat anymore. Therefore, why continue to support the war in Ukraine to the level it has been? And I suspect we're going to see, at the end of this fighting season, we're going to see increased diplomatic efforts to see how this war can be brought to a close.
So whatever the reasons behind what really happened with the grain, and as you say, Zelensky having a good night's sleep, maybe picking up the phone saying, look, I didn't mean it like that, etc. Could this be a catalyst, though, for almost a rethink? I mentioned the numbers at the beginning. I mean, they are enormous, £35.5 billion. The United States, even here, for nearly £5 billion collectively around the whole of the EU and other Western countries. I mean, it is an extraordinary amount of money. That clearly can't go on.
No, and it's, to be brutally honest, though, it's less about the money and more about the availability of weapons. I mean, we, as a nation, have provided a lot of weapons, but you can't nip down to Sainsbury's and top up your supplies. They are a limited war stock. Once they've been reduced, you take greater risk. Sure. And it takes years to restock those war stocks. I think what's also interesting, though, is the public mood is shifting, whether it's weariness with the war, but a recent CNN poll in the US suggests that over half Americans now don't support continuing to support Ukraine in the war. Yeah. And even in this nation, we've got lots of conflicting domestic priorities now. And bluntly, there is a question that if Russia is no longer the threat to Europe that it potentially was, by continuing support, there are those that argue, actually, you're prolonging a war, that Ukraine will struggle to achieve its objectives. And the danger is the longer it fights, the more it hemorrhages its own capability and the more Russia could push it further back.
And, of course, an election in America next year as well. I mean, that could be absolutely crucial to this. I mean, if America pulled funding or even reduced funding, I mean, that's huge. A change of government or the Republicans find themselves back in the White House, I mean, that could completely rewire this story.
I think it could do, but I think the bigger concern from the West is more President Trump's made very clear that there's a deal to be done. And what he's implying there is that he would sit down with his old friend, Vladimir Putin, and Zelensky and hash out a deal. That would be very difficult for President Zelensky to stomach, but without the West's support, it would be very difficult for him to continue. And I think that will change the dynamics of this war. And therefore, if you were President Putin, you'd be trying to play the long game. That would be dangerous.
Air-Vice, I mean, how long can that go on for? I mean, obviously, that there is, on balance, most people support the idea of helping Ukraine. We've put a lot of effort in. Boris Johnson and his many subsequent leaders of the party have all done their bit. But there's going to be a point, isn't there, when people say, well, you know, how long can this go on for? It's incredibly expensive, too.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, I wish we still had our expert pollster, Scarlett Maguire, here to tell us about, you know, what public opinion really is about Ukraine. Because on the one hand, kind of out of sight, out of mind, we're in the kind of long war, very different from when, you know, it was a very hot war and Russia was, you know, moving towards Kyiv and back. This is a war of complete attrition, you know, reminiscent, as it were, of the Western Front in the First World War. But, you know, in terms of what the West's strategic objectives are, standing with Ukraine is, to me, the only answer. The first answer is the sort of, well, three answers. The moral answer, the invasion of a sovereign country. The self-interested answer, if Ukraine falls, who is next? And the cynical answer, if you like, if you said to the Americans 3 years ago, would you like to spend 3% of your defence budget to destroy the Russian army? They would have said yes, and that's exactly what is happening.
But actually, history tells us otherwise. First of all, look what happened in Afghanistan. Compared to what we've spent in Ukraine, over a 10-year war in Afghanistan, where our own men and women died, both British and American, and yet we were able to roll them over just in a blink of an eye. And secondly, if you know that
I don't understand the point you're making.
The point I'm saying is you're saying it would be very difficult for all these reasons. We've invested so much in the war, but yet we were able to just walk out of Afghanistan like that. And the other point is...
No, the point I'm making is Afghanistan was not going to invade Western Europe.
No,
the reason we need to hold the line with Russia is because of the Baltic states and Poland. And I'm amazed that Poland would at any point flinch in its support for Ukraine. Even if it doesn't believe there's a moral case to support Ukraine, it must know there is a...
Because
Poland was
part
dismembered
of NATO,
by the Soviet Union.
But because it's part of NATO, and I know this because of my experience in Romania, they feel quite gung-ho, those countries, because they feel very supported by the West, the likes of Poland.
I don't think Estonia
Romania
feels particularly
Well,
gung-ho.
I'm telling you that certainly Romania and Bulgaria, they've had quite a lot of money and investment and infrastructure come in from NATO. The other thing is, if you look at the Moldovan Republic, this tiny little veer of land that always gets overlooked between Ukraine...
Yeah, they're not feeling gung-ho.
No, they're not. They're absolutely piggy in the middle. But there's a slither on the east of the Moldovan Republic called Transnistria, which was invaded by Russia shortly after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and it has been a frozen conflict zone ever since, and that,
as there is in Chechnya and Georgia.
But that is what we will see on the east of Ukraine, and it's pitiful for the people who live there.
Yes.
Sure. Can I just offer a view, though? It's easy to look at this from an idealistic perspective, and I think most in the West would turn around and say, you've got to stand by Ukraine, whatever it takes. The problem is, the pragmatist in me is that wars only end either when one side wins, and it looks very unlikely that either side will be able to actually achieve its objectives out of this war. The second one is when compromises are made. And the real question there is Finland in the Winter War was a good example where Finland ceded quite a significant chunk of its territory, but what it won was it won its sovereign integrity and also was able to rebuild its country after the war. And I think that there is a pragmatic view here that says, if you continue to back it to the end, what will that end look like? How many hundreds of thousands more people have to die? And the risk is, particularly when you talk about Crimea, that there's a big red button on President Putin's desk, and the longer this war goes on, the danger is we start to worry about what.
Yeah, but I think the thing about I mean, I think people would be open to a compromise, but it requires the Russians to come to the table. I don't think anyone is in a position now to say to Russia, you can have Crimea if you know the rest of the conflict ends and you withdraw from your occupied territories beyond Crimea. It would take Russia to say, we'll withdraw
if you give us Crimea. That would be a loss for Russia, though. Unless they get the east of Ukraine, they'd consider it a loss.
Listen, we draw a line under that one for the moment.